Hello and welcome to the program. A Moscow court has extended the arrest of 24 Ukrainian servicemen captured by Russian troops in the Kerch Strait until the end of April. The charges they face carry a potential 6-year sentence. Now the sailors' defense team is in the process of launching an appeal against the decision. To talk more about the ongoing confrontation with Russia, we welcome to the studio Anton Korynevych, Associate Professor of International Law. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Alexander.
So first question, the fact that this court hearing was held behind closed door is a bit of a weird sign because Russia, let's face it, Russia loves to advertise that kind of, trial in general. What does that mean if Russia does it behind closed bar?
Oh, well, you're absolutely right that this was a kind of surprise that this trial was behind the closed doors. But you know that Russia has so many times breached the fair trial rights. In this particular case, in the other cases of Ukrainian citizens who are now kept by Russia in the jails like Oleg Sentsov, Alexander Kolchenko and others, so that this is only the one instance, the one example in the big system of, I would say, really the systematic breach of fair trial rights by Russian Federation against the Ukrainian citizens. But in this very particular case, I think it is really linked to the issue that all our captured Ukrainian servicemen, they stated that they are prisoners of war, that they perfectly understand their status, that they perfectly understand their rights and guarantees which are granted by the status, about which we'll talk about before, after this. So I think that this Russian Federation didn't want the Russian public, the Russian audience to see this, to see that there may be another position based on international law, and that Ukrainian citizens are strong in their position, which is guarded by international law in this very instance.
So now, does the status that the Ukrainian sailors revendicate as prisoner of war, does this status protect them or handicap them for the rest of the trial?
Well, first of all, the status of the prisoners of war grants them specific rights and guarantees, which are provided for by the Third Geneva Convention on the treatment of the prisoners of war. And if we look at the conduct of the Russian Federation with these 24-hour Ukrainian servicemen, so there are really a lot of breaches. For instance, they shouldn't be charged, they shouldn't be tried by this very court for this very crime. So for prisoners of war, there may not be such a crime.
So it's a military court, basically.
I'm saying that not only the military court, but the Russian Federation doesn't have the right to start criminal proceedings against the military servicemen of another state who were exercising, who were performing the order of the military command of another state. So there may not be any charges, there may not be any breaches of, let's say, the border or whatever, which are committed in the context of the armed conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So all these charges could have been brought possibly against just a citizen of Ukraine, but not against a military serviceman. So they may be charged only for gross human rights violations, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, but such charges cannot be brought against them. So that is a principal violation of the Russian Federation. And there are some more violations, like for instance that the Russian Federation, that our citizens are kept in the jail for the criminal offenders. Yes, so of course they should be kept in the prisoners of war camp or in the specific other specific rooms. So if we look at these violations by the Russian Federation, there are a lot of them. And really, I think that in this very instance, it is very important that both Ukrainian state and Ukrainian state officials and Ukrainian NGOs, human rights activists, Ukrainian experts, and the attorneys of our Ukrainian servicemen, they have the same position, that they have the right of prisoners of war. And to the prisoners of war, all these charges are just illegal. They could not have been brought against prisoners of war.
No, it is quite interesting that the Ukrainian sailors, cited the Geneva Convention. That means that now more and more, after more and more trial, they are more and more aware of what Russia can do and what Russia can't do. So is there like a big team of lawyers behind them to help them going through this law and to make them aware that we can cite a Geneva Convention during a...
I think that just this is clear for these parties, Ukrainian state officials and attorneys who are now in Moscow protecting our Ukrainian servicemen, that really we have the situation of international armed conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And thus, Geneva Conventions are applicable. And the Third Geneva Convention is the very treaty which provides for the rights and guarantees of the prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are the servicemen of one state who are captured by the army of another state. So look, what do we have now? So they are really prisoners of war. And this convention is rather long in articles, and it provides strictly for the rights and guarantees. So I think, and it is really, this treaty is a very clear one, is very understandable and easy to understand one. So that is why I think there is no two versions, there are no different translations of this convention or interpretations, whatever. So that is why I think attorneys and our Ukrainian servicemen are so strong in their position that they should be regarded as prisoners of war, of course, with taking into account all the rights and guarantees of the prisoners of war.
Now, Russia is not well known for respecting treaties and respecting international law, and especially when it comes to the treatment of prisoners. How to ensure that Russia will follow through and apply this Geneva Convention in that case, and will, apply the revendication of the demands of these Ukrainian sailors?
Well, this is always the hardest question, and of course we cannot answer here this question brilliantly, because we know that Russian Federation, of course, doesn't want to fulfill international legal obligations when it comes to Ukraine and situations in Crimea, in Donbass, in Ukraine in whole after 2014. And of course, Russian Federation does not recognize the very status of international armed conflict between two states. It doesn't recognize the status of the occupation of Crimea, and thus the Russian Federation doesn't recognize the status of the prisoners of war. But we may say that this is only the position of one state, that all the other international community knows the real story, knows that Russia is in war against Ukraine, is an international armed conflict, that we have these prisoners of war now in Moscow. It is absolutely clear for all the international community. So I think that, of course, it's hard to make Russia do something because of its status as a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN and all other issues. But I think that the international community shall now put pressure on the Russian Federation and some particular organizations which deal with let's say, treatment of prisoners of war, which deal with treatment of other categories of persons affected by the armed conflict, in particular International Committee of the Red Cross, shall pay attention to the situation and shall work with the Russian Federation in order to secure that our captured servicemen will be provided the fair treatment and the fair rights.
Now, earlier, the coordinator of the group of lawyers protecting the imprisoned sailors, Nikolai Polozov, said, quote, as the capture of these prisoners of war was a political decision, their release should also be solely the result of a political decision. What does that mean exactly? The election years is upcoming in Ukraine. Do you think that it might help those to put some more pressure to have those Ukrainian prisoners of war released or not? Is it, as Mr. Polozov say, also part of this political game?
Well, I'm always trying to find some legal solutions, but it really looks like here we have this political element, and it is a very active one, that really this is a kind of a political game, and that Russia maybe wants to make some pressure, or maybe wants to make Ukraine do something, or maybe wants to provide some problems for Ukraine really in this election year. We know the elections of the President of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian Parliament in October. But all in all, under the Geneva Convention, these servicemen shall be released. There may be some issues when they may be released, but they shall be released. And
like what kind of issues, for example?
I mean that, for instance, if Russia, let's imagine that the Russian Federation agreed that there is a status of international armed conflict between our two states, they can keep our sailors in prisoners of war camp, for instance, until the conflict ends. So we understand that. So that's a trick, but of course it will not be realized because Russian Federation will not recognize the status. So the solution is always political one, and we really hope that the international pressure, that the work of Ukraine on the diplomatic arena will make our citizens come home again. Now, we must always understand that prisoners of war are not criminals. They are not kept in jails. They are kept in specific camps, in specific, let's say, rooms, just not to let them fight in the armed conflict. So they are not criminals. There is nothing for them to be charged. They didn't commit any crime.
You raised an interesting international law issue here, is that, so if Russia wants to keep them as prisoners of war, it has to admit that it's at war with Ukraine, basically.
Of course, yes, because prisoners of war status is a status which comes to arena, which is effective only when we have the status of international armed conflict, which is war between two states.
Now, in your opinion, what are the prospects for their release? Because there has been some complaint to the European Court of Human Rights, and maybe some concrete steps are going to be put in place. But what is realistically, and what are realistically the prospects, for their release? And does Ukraine right now everything right to secure these sailors' release plus their security also?
Well, it is very hard to analyze all the situation, because we understand that Ukraine can do whatever we can, whatever the state can, but taking into account the position of the Russian Federation, we are not sure that we can secure the immediate release of the captured Ukrainian sailors. I think that the state does what it can, and I think that the state is right, that we try to use all the possible international fora, all the possible international courts, like in particular you stated the example with the European Court of Human Rights. Yes, it works only with the European Convention of Human Rights, but here the Third Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War can be additional source in interpretation of the European Convention of Human Rights. So I think that these are the right steps. I mean, we should try to do our best to secure the immediate release. But I want to pay attention to another issue, that of course we saw all the addresses and all the positions, all the statements of European Union, different states, that all of them call for immediate release of captured Ukrainian servicemen, so that all the international community really understand that these guys are not criminals, they are prisoners of war, and they should be immediately released by the Russian Federation.
So there's a common ground here, and now to conclude this interview, this is not the first trial where Ukrainian prisoners have been taken. It might be the last, but we will see.
This is not the first, because...
But it's quite a peculiar one.
It's quite a peculiar one, because for the first time we see a clear example of prisoners of war kept by Russian Federation and charged by Russian Federation in breach of international law.
Which brings me to my last question. Do you think this trial might be a turning point into the file and the complaints that Ukraine is building against Russia in its all amount of violation of international law? Do you think it might help to this file?
I think it may be additional argument in many of courts, like European Court of Human Rights, like International Criminal Court. But again, it should be very peculiarly stated, and it can work as an additional argument, for instance, in the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. So yes, it can work.
Well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today. That was Anton Korynevych, Associate Professor of International Law. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.